Hey guys, tonight we begin with the grim, dangerous, and not so glamorous world of medieval assassins. Those shadowy figures who crept through castle halls and darkened alleys to change history with a blade and a whisper. While Hollywood makes them look cool, the truth is being a medieval assassin seriously sucked. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's be clear. Have you ever wondered who, in their right mind, would choose a life of murder, shadow, and solitude in the medieval world? Spoiler, no one's sane. Becoming an assassin in the Middle Ages wasn't something people dreamed about. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't profitable. It was, most of the time, the last resort of someone with nothing left to lose. In a time where survival was already a full-time job, those who turned to killing for hire were often orphans, deserters, criminals on the run, or disgraced knights. These weren't people with options. They were the leftovers of a brutal system. Cast out, invisible, and desperate. Imagine being a kid whose parents died from the plague, wandering from village to village, stealing food just to eat. Or a soldier who fought in endless wars for a lord who forgot your name the moment the battle ended. You return home with no coin, no land, no honor. What do? You fade into the margins. Or worse, you sharpen a blade and start asking the right questions in the wrong taverns. There were no schools for assassins, no formal training, no academies with banners or lessons or scrolls. Just quiet observation and bloody trial and error. You might learn from another killer if you were lucky. If not, you'd learn from your mistakes, if you lived long enough to make more than one. Many came from backgrounds of relentless hardship. Hunger wasn't an occasional inconvenience, it was a permanent companion. Disease swept through towns like whispers of doom. Every day was survival, and sometimes the quickest way to survive was to eliminate someone else. Not out of hate, out of necessity. It was cold, it was practical, it was medieval logic. Some were trained soldiers who had grown numb to killing. The battlefield was their school, death was their curriculum. When wars ended, these men didn't turn into farmers. They drifted, weapons still sharp, eyes still scanning crowds for threats. They were dangerous and unwanted. Perfect candidates for darker work. Others were peasants who had seen too much death to care anymore. Their families gone, their homes burned, their futures erased. All that remained was the ability to wield a blade or choke a man quietly in the sea. Dark mercenaries were another source. Battle-hardened, but with no loyalty. They realized that one well-placed assassination paid more than a month in the battlefield, and without the risk of open combat. Killing became a skill, and skills paid the bills. The medieval assassin wasn't a master of martial arts or a shadow walking ninja. He was a man who could blend into a crowd, follow an order without asking questions, and disappear before the screams started. Sometimes he worked alone, sometimes in pairs, rarely more. Coordination was a luxury. Simplicity was survival. There were women too, not many, but enough to whisper about. Poisoners, seductresses, messengers who delivered more than parchment. Society didn't see them coming, which made them perfect. They moved unnoticed in a world that never expected violence from their hands. That was their greatest weapon. Religious. Fanatics also found their way into the business. Some believed they were carrying out divine justice, that the blade was just an extension of God's will. They were zealots, willing to die as quickly as to kill. A few became martyrs, most just became forgotten names in dusty ledgers, and there were those driven by revenge. Not justice, revenge. They had personal scores to settle. A murdered sibling, a stolen land, a dishonor too great to bear. When no one else would act, they became the blade. In towns, they lived among the poorest. In cities, they hid in alleys, markets, forgotten corners. No one made eye contact. No one asked questions. They were rumors more than people. Whispers, not names. If you were hiring one, you didn't use a name. Just a coin pouch and a target. Their lives were unbearably dull between jobs. They waited in silence, waited for word, for a message, for someone to come and say, "It's time." Days, weeks, months, alone, in the filth of taverns, in the shadows of back streets. They had no possessions, no homes. What they carried fit in a satchel or under a cloak, a blade, a vial, sometimes a disguise. Their lives had no room for attachment. No pets, no family, no friends. Attachment meant leverage. Leverage meant death. They were not heroes. They were not villains. They were simply forgotten souls turned into tools. The line between killer and corpse was razor thin, and they walked it every day. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't romantic. It was mechanical. It was patient. It was devastatingly, soul-crushingly boring when not horrifying. They did not speak much. Speaking led to slips. Slips led to mistakes. Mistakes led to death. Silence was golden. Silence was safe. Silence was everything. Most never lived past 30. If disease didn't take them, a blade did. If not a blade, betrayal. If not betrayal, sheer misfortune. They died in gutters, in alleys, on roadsides. Their names unspoken, their faces forgotten. And those who lived longer, they lived in fear, paranoia. The blade they once held could now be at their back. The coin they took had marked them forever. Sleep was rare, peace rarer still. They weren't heroes. They weren't villains. They weren't even stories people wanted to hear. The people who became assassins in the Middle Ages were rarely talked about even then. They were the ignored, the passed over, the forgotten faces, in a crowd that was already too full. In fact, many of them didn't even consider themselves assassins at first. It was just a job, just a task. Something that someone had to do because someone else had the money and the desire, and they happened to be the unlucky ones desperate enough to say yes. There wasn't a particular look. There wasn't a uniform. You wouldn't recognize one if you passed him in a muddy village street or bumped into her in a candle-lit tavern corner. They didn't wear black cloaks with red markings. They didn't have secret tattoos or special daggers. Most of the time, they looked exactly like everyone else. Tired, hungry, damp from the endless drizzle. Just another body surviving in a world that didn't care if they lived or died. What kind of person became an assassin? It started with poverty. Deep, suffocating poverty that turned every morning into a question mark and every night into a hunger that couldn't be silenced. Then came loss. Not just of family or home, but of meaning. When you wake up too many times wondering why, the answers start to blur, and eventually, you stop asking. That's when the shadow creeps in. That's when someone can whisper an offer, and instead of shock or horror, there's just a nod. Some were young. Too young. Boys who watched their families slaughtered by raiders or abandoned after a war ended and the soldiers never came back. Girls who saw their mothers die in childbirth and were left to fend off the cold with only threadbare clothes and a tin cup. These children grew up fast, faster than they should have. And when someone finally noticed them, not to care but to use, they didn't resist. What was there to resist? They didn't learn in schools or train in courtyards. They watched, quietly, patiently, sometimes from corners of kitchens or alleys or cathedral pews. They listened to the cruel things nobles said when they thought no one else could hear. They memorized the way guards moved. They understood where doors creaked and how long candles burned. All the details no one thought mattered were the only things they kept. Their education wasn't formal. It was accidental. But it was effective. One cut in the wrong place, and a noble bled like a pig. One well-placed whisper in a servant's ear, and a gate stayed unlocked at midnight. It wasn't about muscle. It wasn't about violence. It was about noticing what others didn't. They didn't brag. They didn't share. They didn't journal or confess. They carried everything in silence. And it was heavy. Heavier than any sword. The towns they came from often didn't remember them, or pretended not to. Who wants to admit that the quiet child who fetched water from the well now strangles men in the dark for coins? Better to say he moved away, or she married a merchant. Safer that way. Their motivations were never simple. It wasn't just money. It wasn't even revenge most of the time. It was the need to feel control. In a world where everything else was dictated by birth, by class, by disease, by war, this one thing, this one terrible, irreversible act was theirs. No one could take it back. No one could undo it. And for that brief moment, they weren't powerless. Some cried after their first job. Some vomited. Others didn't feel a thing. And that terrified them more. That numbness. That calm. It meant something inside had already broken long before the blade touched skin. They rarely stayed in one place. Not just for safety, because staying meant facing what they did. Staying meant roots. Roots meant vulnerability. They didn't want to be found by victims' families, by former employers, by themselves. So they walked from village to village, town to town, forest to forest, always walking, always watching, never trusting. They weren't admired. They weren't feared in the way stories suggest. Most people didn't believe they existed. And the ones who did wished they didn't. Because if they existed, it meant anyone, anywhere, could be next. Sometimes they were caught. When they slipped. When they aged. When their hands shook or their minds wandered. And when that happened, there were no trials. Just punishment. Brutal. Final. A hanging if they were lucky. Torture if they weren't. There are no monuments to them. No relics, no famous names, only rumors. Stories passed down in whispers. A servant who vanished. A lord who died mysteriously. A dagger found beneath a chapel bench. And so they vanish. Over and over. Not just from sight, but from memory. From history. From everything. They weren't monsters. But they weren't innocent either. They were something in between. Something murky. Something no one wanted to look at too long. And that's who really became assassins in the Middle Ages. Not legends. Not demons. Just the forgotten. The broken. The invisible souls know. One missed until it was too late. It almost never began with a conversation. There wasn't a contract, not officially. There weren't open requests in town squares or scrolls passed between officials. Most of the time, the hiring of a medieval assassin started with a look, a subtle, lingering glance across a tavern, a coded phrase spoken too casually, a question asked at the right moment, with just the right tone of voice. No one said the word kill. No one said murder. It was all implication, all shadow, all silent understanding. The person looking to hire was rarely the one with blood on their hands. It was someone with influence or coin or both, a noble, a landowner, sometimes even a priest. They had a problem, a rival, an obstacle, someone whose continued existence was inconvenient. And because public justice was messy, political, or slow, they needed something simpler, something final. That's when they'd whisper to someone trusted, who would whisper to someone else. Until the word found its way to a man with a blade and no questions, or a woman with a vial and steady hands. There was no marketplace for killers, no assassin's guild house. Just a thread of desperation and greed that wove its way through the right or wrong people. The assassin didn't apply. They waited. They watched. Sometimes for weeks, they would sit in a corner of a loud tavern, listening for hints, rumors, complaints said too often, names repeated too bitterly. Patterns emerged. Patterns meant someone was close to paying. That's when they'd make themselves known. Never directly, just a presence. A shadow that lingered a little too long. An answer when no one else responded. Payment was never straightforward. Coin, yes, but not always. Sometimes land, sometimes secrets, sometimes favors promised in silence. It depended on who was asking and who was dying. As for the targets, they were almost never random. A rival lord, a loud merchant, a political opponent, a knight with the wrong loyalties, a mistress who knew too much, a messenger who saw the wrong scroll. Rarely was it personal. It was business, cold, measured, calculated. The higher the profile, the greater the risk, which meant more money. But more money didn't always mean the job was accepted. Some assassins had a sense of their own limits. Others had none. Those ones didn't last long. Sometimes the client wanted it to look like an accident, a fall, a fever, a robbery gone wrong. Other times, they wanted a message. Public, violent, unforgettable. The assassin adjusted accordingly. Blades weren't always necessary. Sometimes poison, sometimes drowning, sometimes just the right push at the right moment. But there was never trust. Not truly. The person who hired you could just as easily be the person who betrayed you. 2. Tie up loose ends. To avoid confession. To keep their name clean. The assassin knew this. That's why they never lingered. Never came back. Never gave their real name. A meeting place was usually neutral. A clearing. A ruined chapel. A broken well. Something old and ignored. There, the deal would be made. Often without a single name. Spoken aloud. Just descriptions. Habits. Locations. A nod. Then the assassin would leave. Alone. From that point on, they watched. They stalked. They memorized routines. The target's sleep patterns. Their guards' laziness. The locks on their doors. The times they were most alone, not out of curiosity, out of necessity, out of cold professional need. And when the moment came, it came fast, quiet, final, no ceremony, no glory, no announcement, just the end, and the assassin would vanish again. Payment would arrive in a hidden place, or sometimes it wouldn't. Sometimes the assassin had to track it down, or threaten the one who offered it. Sometimes they never got paid at all. But that's another story. Hiring a killer in the Middle Ages wasn't a formal process. It was a murmur in the dark, a coin passed under a cloak, a life measured in secrets and silence. And if you were lucky, very lucky, it ended with only one person dead. They said it would be simple. They said it would be quick. One target, one knife, one pouch of coins. That's what they always said at the start. The promises were clean. The instructions were vague. The smiles were thin. But behind every soft word was a lie, and behind every lie was a betrayal waiting to happen. Assassins in the Middle Ages didn't live in stories. They lived in mud and smoke and silence. They didn't have contracts with wax seals. They didn't sign oaths with daggers and blood. Most of the time, they didn't even get a proper name. Just a description, a location, and a whisper that something would be waiting after the job was done. But promises are cheap, and silence is cheaper, especially when it's paid for with the blood of someone else. The job would begin the same way. A meeting in a forgotten place, a ruined barn, a cellar beneath an inn, a field where no one walked anymore. The client always came cloaked, always nervous, always pretending they weren't about to hire death itself. The assassin would listen, nod, maybe ask one or two questions, then vanish. No papers were exchanged, no names repeated, just the understanding that something terrible was about to happen and that someone would be better off for it. Then came the waiting, the planning, the days and nights spent memorizing a stranger's life, down to when they liked to eat and when they relieved themselves behind the same tree each morning. The assassin knew more about their target than anyone else. It wasn't personal, but it was intimate. The kill, when it came, was the least complicated part. A blade in the dark, a nudge near a cliff, a cup handed with a smile. The end, silent and sudden. And then the assassin left. Not triumphant, not proud, just gone. That's when the real work began, finding the payment. Because more often than not, it wasn't where it was promised. The chest was empty, the satchel missing, the contact gone. Sometimes the entire building where they first met no longer existed, burned down, boarded up, vanished. At first there would be confusion. Maybe it was delayed. Maybe there was a mistake. But the assassin knew better. They always knew better, because betrayal was the true currency of assassination. More common than gold, more reliable than silver. It came with the territory. Clients lied, constantly. They changed the terms, claimed the job wasn't done right, said the death was too quick, too messy, too obvious, or not obvious enough. There was always an excuse, always a reason why the coin hadn't been delivered. And what was the assassin going to do? File a complaint? Appeal to a king? No, they were shadows, tools. And when a tool outlived its usefulness, it was discarded. Sometimes it was worse. Sometimes the client didn't just refuse to pay. Sometimes they tried to kill the assassin too, to tie up loose ends, to make sure no one could link them to the crime. So the assassin had to plan for that as well. Escape routes, disguises, backup identities. Sometimes they had to kill twice, once for the job, once for the payment. Trust wasn't just rare, it was poison. To trust was to die. That's what they learned, again and again. Some assassins got clever. They demanded part of the payment up front. Others took a hostage to ensure the client's honesty. Some left warnings, threats carved into wood or whispered into ears. But even then, the betrayals kept coming. Because fear fades, greed doesn't. Every assassin had stories. A noble who vanished the night after the job. A merchant who paid in cursed coin. A scribe who promised access to forbidden scrolls and delivered poison instead. And so, the assassin adapted. They became paranoid. They began to suspect everyone, every look, every word, every delayed payment. Sometimes the assassin didn't even care about the money. Sometimes it was about proving a point, about finding the client and letting them know, quietly, permanently, that betrayal wasn't without consequence. These retaliations became legend, or at least the parts that survived did. Of course, those retaliations came with a cost. The more you avenged yourself, the more known you became. And the more known you became, the more dangerous your life was. Assassins weren't supposed to be names. They were supposed to be rumors. But how do you live when you're lied to over and over? How do you keep moving when the only thing you can count on is that the people who hired you would rather see you dead than paid? The answer, slowly, carefully, and always alone. So many assassins didn't survive their first betrayal. They believed the promise. They waited too long. They asked the wrong questions, and they paid for it. With everything. The smart ones learned. They trusted no one. They kept moving. They kept their circles tight. They stopped hoping for fairness. They accepted the lies. Not because they were weak, but because they had no other choice. And still, the jobs came. The coins, when they arrived, were cold and untraceable, tossed into wells, hidden in dead drops, passed by silent couriers. Payment, when it came, was as cold as the act itself, unceremonious, uncelebrated. There were no thank yous, no acknowledgments, just coin, or sometimes a note, a symbol, a quiet nod from someone in a crowd. Sometimes the assassin wouldn't even know if the client survived, or if they were killed by someone else, or if the whole thing was a test, a trap, a loop. Everything was uncertain. Every deal, a gamble. Every word, a possible lie. And still, they killed. Not because they liked it, not even because they needed to, but because it was all they had, and because someone always asked, and someone always promised payment, and someone always lied. There were no special blacksmiths forging secret weapons in caves, no enchanted blades passed down through bloodlines. Most assassins in the Middle Ages carried what they could find, steal, or salvage. Their tools weren't polished or poetic. They were practical, improvised, sometimes broken, always quiet. A sword was too loud, too long, too obvious. If you saw someone walking through a village with a sword, you watched them. You remembered them. Assassins didn't want to be remembered, so they carried knives. Short, dull, easy to hide, easy to lose, easy to replace. Some carried awls, others carried sharpened sticks, bone needles, fish hooks, a kitchen knife with a broken handle, a belt buckle filed to a point, tools that didn't look like weapons until they were already inside someone. Nothing shiny, nothing expensive. Poison was common, but not the kind from fancy apothecaries. No glass vials with skulls on them, just mold scraped from bread, berries crushed into paste, mushrooms boiled into sludge, rat poison stolen from barns, a powder mixed into wine, a droplet smeared on a doorknob. Subtle, slow, terribly effective. Some assassins preferred cords, ropes, even their own belts. Quiet, efficient. A garrote made from a horse's hair, a strip of leather soaked in oil, something that could be wrapped, twisted, pulled. One breath, then none. They didn't carry gear in fancy pouches. They didn't wear armor. Armor clinked. Armor caught the light. Armor made you sink in the river when you needed to swim. They wore layers, rags, cloaks with holes, boots with one sole flapping. Nothing that stood out. Everything that blended. Disguises weren't clever. They were simple. Mud on the face, a scarf over the mouth, a hood pulled low, looking like someone no one wanted to look at twice. That was enough. That was the point. Locks could be picked, but not with tools made for it. With nails, with bones, with slivers of metal pulled from wagon wheels. Anything thin, strong, and sharp. Precision came from repetition, not equipment. Some carried coins with edges shaved to razor sharpness, a ring with a hidden needle, a boot heel with a compartment carved out for a blade. None of it was elegant. All of it was desperate, and still, they survived. Because they learned. They adapted. They didn't waste time on craftsmanship or beauty. They didn't have the luxury. A beautiful dagger wouldn't save you when the guards came knocking. A poisoned rag might. They watched the world like scavengers. A broken hinge could become a weapon. A cracked mug, a distraction. A chicken bone, a stabbing tool. Nothing was useless. Everything could be deadly. Their arsenal fit in a satchel no larger than a loaf of bread, sometimes smaller. And they knew how to use each item better than most soldiers knew how to swing a sword. Preparation was everything. They tested doors days before the kill, studied where light fell at different hours, marked the places where footsteps echoed. They didn't need advanced weapons. They needed control, patience, timing. Even the way they carried their tools mattered. A knife in the sleeve, a pin sewn into the cuff, a stone in the boot heel. They practiced drawing them silently, without looking, because looking could cost seconds, and seconds could cost lives. Sometimes they didn't bring anything. Sometimes they used what was at the scene. A chair leg, a bowl, a curtain cord, the candle holder, the victim's own clothing. Improvisation wasn't a skill, it was a necessity. They had no backups, no supply rooms, no allies to resupply them. If something broke or was lost, they made do, or they waited, or they ran. And they rarely reused tools. Too risky, too recognizable. A dagger seen once could be described. A bottle reused could carry traces. One job, one tool, then gone. They didn't admire their weapons. They feared them, because every item they carried was a reminder of what they were about to do, of what they'd already done. Sometimes they would throw everything away after a job. Not just the weapon, the clothes, the boots, the satchel, all of it, into a river, a fire, a well. Anything to erase the evidence and the memory. No trophies, no souvenirs, no collections. Just weight. Always weight, and over time, that weight grew heavier. Not physically, but mentally. Every makeshift tool became a story, a face, a moment, until even a belt felt like a noose, until even a pin felt like a wound. That's the reality of an assassin's equipment, not clever gadgets or shiny swords, just whatever worked, whatever killed, whatever could be dropped, lost, or forgotten. Because in the end, it wasn't about the weapon. It was about the silence that followed. Killing someone important was never just about skill. It was about everything else. Timing, weather, doors that creaked too loud, servants who stayed too long, guards who didn't drink enough to fall asleep. Killing a noble or a general or a bishop wasn't a job. It was a puzzle, and most of the pieces were missing. The first challenge was access. Important people didn't walk alone. They didn't sleep in wooden huts with loose shutters. They slept behind stone walls, locked gates, layers of steel and suspicion. They had guards who didn't blink, dogs who didn't bark without reason, maids who noticed when the wine glass moved a little too far to the left. So the assassin had to become invisible, not by magic, but by patience, watching every pattern, counting footsteps, learning which door was used most, which servant was clumsy, which hour was quietest. Sometimes it took weeks, sometimes months, just for one chance, one moment, and even then, there was no guarantee. Targets with power had paranoia. They moved, rooms without notice. They tasted food with silver. They never bathed alone. They trusted no one. And for good reason. The assassin couldn't afford a mistake. One wrong breath, one slip on wet stone, one cough at the wrong time. That was the difference between vanishing into the night or being hanged by morning. Plans weren't plans. They were guesses, adjusted daily, abandoned often. An open window meant opportunity. A closed curtain meant start over. Rain meant silence. Wind meant cover. A crow in the courtyard could mean a delay, and when the moment came, it was never perfect. It was always messy, too quick, too loud, too dark. The blade didn't slide. The scream wasn't stifled. The guard turned around. Always something. Getting away was its own impossible task, because the target's death wasn't quiet. It rippled through halls, through rumors, through revenge, and the walls that once let you in now tried to keep you in. Doors locked, horses hidden, roads watched. The castle became a trap, the city a cage. Assassins who took on high-profile targets didn't just risk death, they guaranteed it. Maybe not now, maybe not today, but it was coming. One face remembered, one detail noticed, one spy paid enough to talk. The reward might be higher, but so was the price. Because these weren't just people, they were names. Names with reach, with families, with armies. Some assassins said no, refused the job, walked away. Others said yes, and never said anything again. And sometimes just Sometimes the job was a trap from the start. The client wanted you caught, wanted the chaos, wanted to blame the death on someone else. You weren't the weapon. You were the scapegoat. Even success didn't mean safety. You might kill the Duke, but his cousin ruled the next province, and his soldiers had dogs, and maps, and time. The world wasn't fair, and killing someone important didn't make it better. It made it worse, because the more powerful the target, the less likely the story ended with a clean getaway. Sometimes, the assassin never even got close. Too many eyes, too much noise, too much change. They walked away, quietly, silently, swallowed the failure, buried it like a body. Other times they took the shot, missed, fled, hid for weeks, for months, in cellars, in caves, in sickness and fear. Some never came back, not because they died, but because they broke. The hardest kills weren't about the kill at all. They were about what happened after. Who came asking? Who came hunting? Because killing someone who mattered meant you mattered too. And that was the last thing an assassin wanted. They didn't want to be remembered, especially by people who sent swords instead of letters. And yet, the jobs kept coming, because the world always had someone in power, always had someone who needed to disappear, and always had someone desperate enough to try, even when the odds said don't, even when the walls grew higher, even when the guards never slept. Even then, someone would say yes, and try to make the impossible happen. To not be noticed, you had to be ordinary, painfully ordinary, forgettable in every way. That was the first rule. Assassins in the middle. Ages didn't wear costumes. They didn't become monks or jesters or knights. They became invisible by becoming unremarkable. Clothing mattered more than weapons. A coat that blended into dust. A tunic with a faded pattern no one looked at twice. Shoes that didn't squeak. A hood that stayed low. The kind of fabric that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. Nothing that caught attention, nothing that told a story. Hair mattered. Too long and you looked proud. Too short and you looked strange. Dirty was best. Unkempt. Lived in. A style that said, I'm not worth looking at. Because if someone remembered your face, the job was already lost. Smell mattered too. You couldn't smell clean. You had to smell like the street. Like hay, ash, or mold. Like someone who slept near pigs or cooked in a smokehouse. No one suspected a man who smelled like sweat and onions. Posture, voice, walk. It all mattered. No straight backs, no confident strides, no eye contact. If you looked like you didn't belong, you were noticed. If you looked too careful, too prepared, you were watched. So you practiced being awkward, slouching, stumbling, staring at the ground, shrinking. You didn't become someone else. You became no one at all. Sometimes the disguise was a role, a beggar, a stable hand, a merchant's helper. But you couldn't play it too well. Too much skill meant suspicion. You had to be bad at your fake job just enough to be ignored. You learned accents, phrases, local jokes, names of people you'd never met, stories that weren't yours. All of it, just to blend. The best assassins never looked like threats. They looked like problems. People others wanted to avoid. The coughing man in the alley. The limping woman by the well. The boy with missing teeth selling bruised apples. And when you needed to disappear again, you changed fast. In stables, behind bushes, in the middle of a crowd. You turned a scarf inside out, switched shoes with a corpse, rubbed mud into your cheeks. That was the magic. Mud and misdirection. Nobles had disguises too, but they wore jewels on the inside of their sleeves. They played dress up. Assassins didn't play. They survived. They never used the same look twice. A beard one week, a burn mark the next, a sling on the arm, a cough, a hunch, even a limp if they could fake it long enough. The hardest part was staying still when someone looked too long. Not reacting, not breathing harder, just being still. Because moving meant guilt, and guilt meant death. You never dressed like a hero. Heroes had stories, songs, enemies. You dressed like someone the world already forgot. Because the best disguise wasn't a costume. It was a life no one thought was worth remembering. They ate alone, always, in corners of rooms, facing the door, watching, not chewing too loudly, not drinking too much, not speaking unless it was required. Even then, their voices were low, flat, measured. Sleep came in fragments, a few minutes here, an hour there, one eye always open, one ear always tuned to footsteps, creaking wood, whispered voices. Dreams weren't welcome. They reminded them of things they couldn't have. They didn't keep pets. Pets made noise. Pets formed habits. Habits made you predictable. Predictable meant dead. They didn't keep friends. Friends asked questions. Friends noticed changes. Friends expected loyalty. Assassins couldn't afford any of that. Family, if they had any, was a memory. Distant, blurred, a shape in a doorway, a song in a different tongue. Something lost before the blade was ever drawn. Most of them didn't use their real names. Some didn't remember them, or didn't want to. A name was a thread, a way back, a way in. They moved often, never stayed, longer than needed. A day, a night, maybe two if the job was difficult. Any longer and someone might recognize the pattern, the cloak, the limp, the way they stirred their soup. The world was loud, but they moved through it in silence. Markets bustled, taverns roared, churches echoed. But assassins slipped between the noise, always outside the circle, always just behind the light. They learned not to hope. Hope led to wanting. Wanting led to mistakes. Mistakes were not forgiven in their world. They avoided children. Children saw things, asked questions, didn't know when to stay silent. Their laughter was too sharp, their trust too immediate, and their honesty too dangerous. Lovers were dangerous. Love made you soft, made you stay, made you talk. And the moment you talked, the mask slipped. Love demanded presence. Assassins could never truly be present, so they chose solitude. Not because they liked it, but because it was the only thing that never lied. It never turned on them. It never asked them to be anything else. They walked through forests without names, slept in abandoned mills, ate bread stolen from windowsills, drank from puddles, from wells, from anything that didn't reflect their face too clearly. Even their reflection became a stranger over time. They didn't write, didn't sketch, didn't collect. Memories were too heavy to carry. Memory was a weight with no place to put it down. Sometimes they whispered to themselves, just to hear a voice, just to prove they still had one, to remind themselves they still existed, even if barely. They feared firelight. It made shadows dance, wrong, made them feel too visible, too warm. Comfort was a trap, warmth a deception. So they chose cold, stone, wind, distance, the edge of things. Life lived just beyond the borders of maps and minds. They saw people celebrate, feast, sing, and they walked past. Because to stop was to be seen. To be seen was to risk everything. Every smile was suspicious. Every kindness a test. Every invitation a potential noose. Behind every door was a possibility they couldn't afford to trust. They avoided attachments the way others avoided poison. No names exchanged, no routines built, no places revisited. Every interaction was temporary. Every relationship a liability. If someone asked where they were from, they answered with a shrug. If someone asked where they were going, they said nowhere, because nowhere was the safest place to be. They trained themselves to enjoy nothing, to take no pleasure in taste or smell or warmth, because pleasure led to comfort, and comfort dulled the senses. Dull senses led to death. They slept in trees, in barns, under bridges, on roofs, places where no one else would think to look, places that smelled of rot and rain and dust, hidden corners of forgotten places. They spoke in half sentences, in nods, in gestures. Words were dangerous. Words revealed patterns. Words created bonds. Bonds became anchors. Anchors pulled you down. They learned to be patient with silence, to befriend it, to measure time in breaths, not minutes, in heartbeats, not hours. The tick of time was marked by instinct, not clocks. Their loneliness wasn't loud. It was thick, heavy, constant, like a cloak soaked in sorrow. It followed them like a second skin. They didn't cry, not because they were strong, but because they forgot how. Tears belonged to people who could be hurt. They didn't sing, not because they were silent, but because the songs were all about people who were remembered, and assassins weren't meant to be remembered. They watched others build lives, children growing, markets expanding, lovers meeting, and they kept walking, because stopping meant becoming real, and being real meant being hunted. In rare moments, they thought about stopping, about staying, about changing. But the thought passed quickly, like a shadow at dusk, like breath on a window, because even if they wanted to, they wouldn't know how. They had spent too long on the edge of the world. Loneliness wasn't a symptom, it was the job, the lifestyle, the only guarantee. The shadow cast by every step they took. They didn't die in battle. They didn't die with honor. They died in silence, in shadows, in spaces that didn't have names, and no one wept. No one knew. The world turned. The sun rose. The birds sang, the same as it had the day before. And in some dark place, another assassin ate alone. Always. Failure wasn't a second chance. It wasn't a lesson. It wasn't an opportunity to grow. In the life of a medieval assassin, failure was death. Not immediate, not always, but inevitable. The consequences were never delayed forever. They came, slowly, brutally, unforgivingly. The moment something went wrong. The wrong man stabbed, the wrong drink poisoned, the wrong guard still awake. It began. The unraveling, the punishment, the sentence. Sometimes it was swift, a blade from behind, a rope in the night. Not from an enemy, but from a former client. Someone who couldn't afford the attention. Someone who didn't want loose ends. A secret, buried deeper than the body of the target. Other times it was slow, a name passed in whispers, a face drawn in charcoal, a bounty posted in a village square. The assassin became prey, hunted by guards, by mercenaries, by others like them, looking to earn favor, coin, or safety. Failure meant more than exposure. It meant betrayal. Allies turning, hideouts burned, messages unanswered, people pretending they never knew you. Because now you were a risk, a reminder, a warning. If you survived the first few days, the next ones were worse. Hunger, paranoia, sleep that wouldn't come, trust that didn't exist. Every shadow was a trap, every sound a threat. Even silence began to scream. Your weapons turned on you, a knife dulled too quickly, a vial cracked in your pack. The tools you once mastered now betrayed your shaking hands. The weight of them grew heavier. Familiar edges became burdens. Steel, once comforting, now mocked you. In villages, people stared too long. In cities, guards paused as you passed. Every cough was suspicion. Every question a test. Every welcome a lie waiting to unfold. And if they caught you, if they truly caught you, then came the real consequences. Torture was common, not for information, but for spectacle. You were made an example, hung from walls, left in cages, paraded through streets, a warning etched into flesh, a story written in blood. They wanted to see fear, wanted to see you break, wanted to prove that no one was beyond reach. And the people watched. Some pitied, most didn't, because fear was easier than empathy. Sometimes it wasn't the law. It was the family, the brother, the cousin, the widow. They didn't care about rules. They cared about blood. And they would find you, not to question, just to make you disappear. You could run, disguise, hide under new names. But failure left a scent, a mark, a trail. It clung to your steps, followed your breath, and in your mind, it played again and again. The moment it went wrong, the look in their eyes, the last breath, the silence after. It echoed, louder than any punishment. It never stopped. You stopped eating, stopped speaking. Some assassins stopped living long before they died. Their bodies moved, their minds didn't. Their hearts beat only out of habit, because the shame was heavier than the sword, the silence more crushing than the cage, the memories sharper than any blade. In the rarest cases you were spared, exiled, cut loose, but that was worse, because now you lived with the memory, with the eyes of the dead blinking every time you closed yours, with the knowledge that you had failed and were still alive. Others tried to redeem themselves, took riskier jobs, more desperate targets. But desperation is a scent too. And clients smelled it, used it, exploited it. They paid less, demanded more, offered no safety. They sent you after monsters, after kings, after ghosts, hoping you'd vanish, hoping you'd fail again. Because a failing assassin was as useful as a dead one, until they were both. Some failed twice. No one failed 3 times. Failure isolated you even from other assassins. They wouldn't speak to you, wouldn't acknowledge you. You were a reminder that the shadows weren't safe, that death could come from hesitation, from error, from anything. And the worst part, sometimes the job was done right, but the client said it wasn't, lied, refused to pay, claimed it was messy, claimed it brought questions, said it was a failure, even when it wasn't. And that counted the same. There were no appeals, no way to explain, no one to believe you. Your side of the story never mattered. Not in this world. You were what they said you were, a failure. And in the world of assassins, that meant you were already dead. Even if your heart kept beating, even if your feet kept walking, the world had already buried you. All that remained was the waiting. And the waiting was long. It stretched into the cracks of time. It seeped into your bones. You listened for steps that never came, yet you couldn't stop listening. You scanned the dark even when it was just you and your shadow. The fear became routine. You wrapped yourself in it, slept beside it, ate with it. It was the only companion that stayed, the only one that never turned. Days blurred. You forgot what warmth felt like. You forgot what your voice sounded like. You forgot the names of your fingers, the lines of your face. Mirrors were avoided, faces were forgotten. You counted time in moments of panic, in breaths held too long, in flinches, in sprints from imagined pursuers. You never let your back touch a door, never trusted silence that lasted too long. You stopped sleeping entirely, closed your eyes only when your body gave up, woke at the crack of every branch, the flutter of every bird. The body broke down slowly. You didn't notice at first. Muscles weakened, vision dimmed, hands shook, scars opened, skin thinned. Your instincts, once sharp, dulled. You missed things, forgot details, dropped tools, lost track of time. And when death came, you weren't surprised. You almost welcomed it, because finally, something certain. But even then, it wasn't peaceful. Because in the end, all that was left was the memory of failure, the echo of the moment it went wrong. And even death couldn't silence that. Success wasn't celebration. It wasn't glory. There was no victory feast, no moment of applause, no warm fire waiting. A successful assassination was followed by silence, not the calm kind, the heavy kind, the kind that pressed down on your chest, the kind that made your own footsteps sound too loud. The job was done. The target was dead. But the work wasn't over, not even close. First came the escape. Always the escape. Before the blood dried, before the eyes closed, before the scream finished echoing down the hall. You had to disappear. Not walk, not run, evaporate, become mist, become memory. Some assassins had a plan, a rope hanging from a tower window, A hidden tunnel beneath the garden. A horse waiting in the woods. Most didn't. Most ran. Through alleys. Across rooftops. Into rivers. Into shadows. Adrenaline was the only map. Then came the cover. The quick change. Clothes reversed. Beard shaved. Dirt smeared. Identity shed like a skin. You stopped being the assassin the moment the blade left the body. Now, you were no one. A farmer. A traveler. A shadow with nothing behind it. But the air changed. Always. You could feel it. People looked longer. Doors stayed closed. Children stared. The world knew. It didn't know who, but it knew something had happened. Something wrong. Something sharp. If it was a clean kill, there was less noise, less panic. Just a body found, a whisper spread, a rumor born. If it was messy, if there was screaming or blood on the steps, then it was chaos. Bells ringing, dogs barking, footsteps racing. The city shifted from living to hunting, and you had to be gone before the shift finished. Sometimes the payment came quickly. A bag tucked under a bench, a ring slipped into your pocket by a stranger, a whisper and a nod and a sudden disappearance. But often it didn't come, not right away, or not at all. You'd return to the meeting spot, wait, watch, nothing. You'd send a message, no reply. You'd return to the place where the deal was made and find it abandoned, or burned, or erased. The success of the job didn't guarantee the success of the reward, because the client had gotten what they wanted. Their enemy was gone, their problem removed. And you were now a liability. A memory they didn't need. A risk they didn't want. So you moved again. To another town. Another road. Another tavern where you drank alone and watched the door. You didn't speak of what you'd done. You didn't think of it. Not if you could help it. But it thought of you. Every noise at night. Every glance that lingered. Every guard who walked too close. Your own success became your shadow. You could feel its breath. You could hear its silence. Because killing someone and walking away meant someone else knew. Someone always knew. Servant, a guard, a child who saw something they shouldn't have. And they told someone, who told someone else, until one day someone told the wrong person, and suddenly you weren't just a shadow, you were a name, a story, a target. So you burned your cloak, buried your tools, changed your walk, learned a new name, a new town, a new story. You said it enough times that it started to feel real. Almost. And still, the face came back. In dreams, in windows, in puddles. The face of the one you killed. The way their mouth hung open. The twitch of their fingers. The sound of their last breath. You didn't regret it. Regret was a luxury, but it lived with you, sat beside you, slept near you. A presence just behind your shoulder. Some assassins took jobs back to back. Didn't let the silence grow. They said it kept them sharp, kept them safe. But it also made them hollow. Others disappeared for months, tried to forget, to wash the scent of blood from their hands with time and distance. But blood didn't wash. It just dried and cracked. You couldn't undo success. You could only survive it. And sometimes, success brought more work. A rival who wanted revenge. A lord who liked your style. A whisper that you were effective. Now more people wanted you. Some to hire, some to hang. And you had to know which was which. You walked carefully, spoke less, trusted no one. The more successful you were, the quieter you became. You learned to red eyes, the twitch of a brow, the tightening of a jaw. You learned which rooms had back doors, which tables faced the wall, which cities had sympathetic apothecaries. Because success didn't buy comfort, it bought danger. It bought enemies. It bought attention, and assassins didn't want attention. There were no songs about the successful kills, no legends, no monuments. Only silence, only missing people, and rumors, always rumors. Sometimes you overheard them, in a market, in a bathhouse, in a chapel. Whispers of the job you did, how it happened, why it mattered. The story was never accurate, but it was always dangerous, and you had to walk away. Always walk away. Even if it meant leaving behind a place that felt safe. Even if it meant burning another name. Success was just another mask, one you wore until it cracked. Some tried to retire, buy land, grow roots, live in peace. But peace didn't. Forget, peace had a long memory. And when it came knocking, it wore a sword. So you stayed moving, stayed silent, stayed watching. Because even when the job was done, completely, cleanly, quietly, it wasn't over. It was never over. And somewhere, someone else was about to offer another job. And you would say yes. Because success wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of what came next. Reputation wasn't something you asked for. It was something that followed you, like a second shadow. Not the kind that helped, the kind that stared, that whispered when you weren't listening, that grew heavier with each step, each kill, each whispered name left behind. In the world of assassins, reputation was a curse carved in silence. You never introduced yourself. Names were dangerous, histories were worse. But reputation didn't care. It clung to your silence. It filled in the blanks. The fewer words you spoke, the more people said about you. The more you tried to disappear, the louder your legend grew. It started small. A job done well. A kill no one saw. A noble dead in his bed and no signs of struggle. People talked. They always did. They wanted stories. So they made them. Maybe you slipped through walls. Maybe you poisoned the air. Maybe you used black magic. Truth didn't matter. Rumor was stronger. Rumor filled taverns faster than facts. And soon you weren't just a man or a woman who killed for coin. You were something else. A myth. A nightmare. People stopped meeting. Your eyes. Innkeepers stuttered when asking how long you'd stay. Children hid behind mothers. Dogs growled without cause. Because they didn't see you. They saw what they'd heard. You tried to change clothes. To walk differently. To speak in new accents. But it didn't matter. The story had already escaped. And once a story escaped, it could never be recaptured. The paranoia came next. Not yours, theirs. Clients hesitated longer before hiring you. Guards doubled when you passed. Bartenders watered your drinks. Doors closed quicker. But eventually, it became your paranoia too. Because maybe they were right to fear. Maybe someone was watching. Maybe someone wanted your name scratched from every whispered tale. You started to sleep with a blade in hand. You never sat with your back to a wall unless you knew there was another exit. Every cough behind you, every loud laugh, every drunk stumbling too close, it all became a reason to move, to vanish. Because reputation made you famous. And assassins weren't meant to be famous. It brought work, yes, but it also brought hunters, bounty seekers, knights with too much pride, peasants looking for justice, bandits hoping to earn a noble's favor. You were a challenge, a trophy, a prize. And every town you entered, someone already knew a version of your story. None of them true. All of them dangerous. You changed faces again, grew a beard, lost it, wore a hood, removed it, learned a limp, lost a finger, covered scars, created new ones. It wasn't enough. Your reputation outlived your disguises. It walked into rooms before you did. It whispered in ears while you slept. It shouted louder than your silence, and so the paranoia rooted deeper. You checked doors twice, then a third time. You never used the same path twice. Never stayed 2 nights. Never spoke without watching the eyes of your listener. You stopped eating full meals. Poison was always a possibility. Even in wine you poured yourself. Even in bread you bought with silver. You kept your pack ready, always, with just enough coin. A blade, a change of clothes, a vial of something deadly. Not for others, for yourself, in case it came to that. You began to dream less, or more. Always vivid, always wrong. Faces of those you killed, faces of those you didn't. Places you barely remembered, places that never existed. Reputation didn't let you rest. Some assassins tried to change the stories. They did jobs for the poor, gave money to orphans, refused to kill children. But the stories didn't change. Because stories weren't yours to shape. They were hungry things. They fed on blood, not kindness. You grew more alone. Other assassins stopped meeting with you. Too dangerous to be near. Too known. Too unpredictable. Even clients became rare. Only the bold or the desperate reached out. And boldness was foolish. Desperation was dangerous. So your reputation walked with you, sat beside you, slept near you. A companion made of other people's fear. And the paranoia grew. You stopped trusting signs. You stopped trusting yourself. Because what if the rumors were true? What if you had become what they said? What if the shadow was no longer behind you, but inside you? So you walked slower, talked less, looked over your shoulder more. Every whisper was about you. Every hand that moved too fast was reaching for a blade. Even nature betrayed you. Birds flew too quickly. Dogs barked without reason. The wind sounded like voices. You couldn't tell what was real. You stopped sleeping altogether. Some nights, sat upright, eyes open, heart drumming, waiting. But for what? Reputation didn't end. It just got louder. And someday it would be the reason you died. Not a failed job, not a missed step. Just a story someone believed too much. And a blade meant for the monster you never meant to become. That's the power of reputation. It outlives the truth. And it never, ever sleeps. Poison was supposed to be clean, quick, quiet. But in reality it was chaotic, unpredictable, uncontrollable. a gamble. Dressed as a certainty, assassins used poison not because it was elegant, but because it was desperate. Because sometimes a blade was too loud. Because sometimes a door was locked. Because sometimes you needed someone to die from across the room. But poison never behaved. Sometimes it worked in seconds. Other times it took hours. Sometimes it killed the wrong person. Sometimes it killed no one at all. Sometimes it gave the victim just enough time to scream your name. You could mix the same ingredients 10 times and get 10 different results. Heat changed it. Air spoiled it. Water diluted it. Metal reacted with it. Your hands, if too sweaty, too cold, too dry, could ruin the entire batch. And yet, assassins kept using it. Because the promise of a quiet death was too tempting. They learned poisons the same way they learned everything else, through whispers and mistakes. A farmer's tale, a healer's secret, a monk's warning, a thief's regret. They carried pouches of dust, bottles of sludge, pins dipped in things with no names, everything labeled in symbols, in scratches, in songs only they remembered. They tested doses on rats, on stray dogs, on themselves. Sometimes they watched a creature die and thought, this will do. But even then, nothing was guaranteed. They poisoned bread, wine, ink, soap, flowers, coins, the hems of robes, the handles of doorways, the rim of a goblet. But people changed habits. Someone skipped a meal. Someone poured a drink for a friend. Someone touched the wrong cloth at the wrong time. The chaos was constant, and then there was the smell, the color, the taste. Some poisons betrayed themselves. Some had to be masked. Some couldn't be. Some required perfect timing. Some required perfect ignorance. Assassins had to know the difference. They learned which poisons left no trace, which caused fevers, which caused silence, which mimicked natural death, which mimicked a curse. They learned which herbs screamed guilt, which mushrooms whispered lies. But learning wasn't knowing, because even after years, poison still surprised them. A man who should have died in seconds lingered for hours, coughing and vomiting and cursing the heavens. A woman meant to sleep, forever instead walked for 2 days before collapsing mid-prayer. And worse, sometimes the poisoner paid the price. The wind shifted, the bottle cracked, the dust scattered, a single breath too deep, a single cut on the finger, a drop absorbed through the skin, and suddenly the assassin was the one on the floor, gasping, convulsing, dying, silently, alone. Poison was chaos wrapped in ritual, and they never forgot it. They never trusted it, but they still carried it, because sometimes it was the only way, and sometimes even chaos was better than a blade. They studied the sources, plants from distant hills, fungi that grew only in rotting logs, insects that produced venom when crushed, roots that twisted into death beneath the soil. The act of gathering these materials was dangerous itself. A misstep, a wrong leaf, a misunderstood color, and you poisoned yourself before you ever uncorked a bottle. Poison making wasn't just skill, it was obsession. The need to measure everything. A pinch too much. Death came too soon, a fraction too little. It didn't come at all. It was a science without numbers, an art without beauty. Storage was another danger. Bottles broke, pouches tore, Even the smallest leak could mean weeks of pain. Some assassins carried their poisons in animal bladders. Others sealed them in wax. A few simply carried none, retrieving it only hours before the deed. And then there were countermeasures. Nobles hired tasters. Priests blessed food. Alchemists were paid to test every drop of wine. Assassins had to plan around this. Sometimes they poisoned the taster first. Sometimes they bribed the cook. Sometimes they created poisons that mimicked spoiled food or natural illness. Even more chaos. No poison was permanent in its form. A recipe that worked one season failed the next. Too much rain, and the berries didn't grow right. Too much sun, and the roots turned bitter. Sometimes the plants simply refused to grow at all, as if the earth itself had grown tired of the blood. So assassins adapted, constantly. They kept notebooks, coded, burned after reading. They talked in riddles. They traded recipes with smugglers and midwives and thieves. But they never trusted what they learned. They tested it themselves, again and again, until they memorized the taste of every petal, the texture of every paste. And still, they failed. They watched people writhe longer than expected. They saw children touch poisoned coins. They heard screams that shouldn't have been possible. Poison demanded cruelty. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind. The kind that watched suffering with still eyes. The kind that waited in shadows while a man clutched his throat. The kind that listened as a woman begged for air. Poison didn't kill. People did. The assassin made the decision. The poison only followed orders. Sometimes assassins made mistakes they couldn't forgive. They'd vanish for months, bury their tools, try to live clean. But the silence haunted them more than the screams. So they returned. To the powders, the pastes, the whispered rituals. Because poison, for all its chaos, was familiar. And assassins trusted familiarity more than they trusted people. They never spoke of the worst cases. The ones who lived, the ones who woke up too soon, the ones who screamed, the ones who clawed at their own skin, the ones who looked them in the eyes as they died. These memories lived in the poison, with every pinch, every drop, every dose, and when they mixed a new vial, they remembered not just the death, but the chaos that always followed. There was no legacy, no monument, no name etched into stone, no child to carry the blood forward. The life of an assassin ended in silence, and the memory of that life ended even faster. The moment they chose the path, their identity began to dissolve, not all at once, slowly, carefully. A name dropped here, a birthplace forgotten there, family erased from stories, friends stopped being visited, places stopped being called home. It started with names. The assassin used a new one for every town. Sometimes it was borrowed, sometimes invented, sometimes stolen from a corpse. They answered to anything, so long as it wasn't the truth. Old names became dangerous. A name was a thread, a way to trace, a way to connect, a way to kill. So they let the names die. Language changed. Accent faded. They stopped singing the songs of their childhood, forgot the proverbs of their village, lost the words their mother used when she tucked them in at night. Memories dulled by intention. They couldn't afford nostalgia. Nostalgia made you hesitate, made you linger. And assassins couldn't linger. They wore faces like masks, smiled when required, frowned when expected, but none of it was real, just layers, just shields. The real face, the real voice, the real soul. It was buried, not in dirt, but in silence. No one knew their story. No one could recite their life. They didn't keep journals, didn't write letters, didn't leave tokens behind. A sword was replaced, a cloak discarded. Even tools were left behind after jobs. Nothing could tie them to the past, because the past didn't belong to them anymore. Assassins weren't just alone. They were blank, clean slates smeared in blood, and over time, even they began to forget. Not just the names, but the people attached to them. The laughter, the anger, the dreams, the beliefs. They became ghosts long before they died. No one mourned them, because no one knew them. No one marked their grave, because there was no grave to mark. They disappeared into forests, cities, rivers, fields, bodies left where no eyes would see, ashes mixed with dirt, bones picked clean by animals. And when someone asked, "Who was that?" there was no answer. Only a shrug, a silence, a turn of the head. Even the people who hired them didn't use real names, didn't want to know, didn't care to remember. The assassin was a blade, not a person. The blade was sharp, the blade was useful, and when it dulled, it was thrown away. Assassins lived in between towns, between lives, between stories, never in them, never of them. They became myth before death, and after death, even the myth faded. No child carried their eyes, no friend carried their laugh, no portrait bore their likeness. The world swallowed them, without resistance, without notice. And that was the point. To kill without being known. To exist without leaving a mark. To live like vapor and vanish like smoke. Even their shadows were temporary, cast only while the sun allowed. And when the night came, even that thin outline disappeared. Some tried to keep something. A ring, a carved token, a mark hidden beneath a sleeve. But over time, even those were lost, forgotten in haste, traded for bread, dropped during a rushed escape. Their image lived only in the half-memory of a frightened servant. A blurred figure glimpsed through fog. A story whispered too quietly to become real, and time did what it always does. It erased. The earth took their bodies. The wind took their names. The silence took their story. There were no songs. Songs were for those who were missed, and no one missed a ghost. In villages, people would remember strange travelers. Someone who stayed one night, ate in silence, paid an exact coin, never smiled, never returned. But no one asked who they were. They might leave a room cleaner than they found it, or they might leave blood behind. Either way, they left nothing. That lingered. No scent, no feeling, no trace. They made themselves forgettable, ordinary. The kind of person you ignored even while staring, and it worked. Too well. Some assassins, after years, tried to reclaim what they lost. Tried to return to old villages, tried to speak old names. But the villages had changed. The names were no longer recognized. The homes were gone. The people were dead. There was no place to return to, because they had never truly belonged. You couldn't leave a legacy if you never stayed still. Couldn't leave a story if you never let it begin. So they walked and kept walking into places no one remembered, among people who didn't ask questions, through forests that didn't care who passed beneath their branches. They spoke less, thought less, dreamed less, until one day they stopped speaking altogether, not because there was no one to speak to, but because there was no one left to be spoken by. A person erased from history doesn't vanish in one moment. They fade in layers. First the name, then the voice, then the face, then the memory, then the meaning. And eventually, there's nothing left but silence, and not even the wind remembers their passing. They never planned to keep their promise. Not really. The client, that is. The one who sat in the dark corner of a tavern, cloak drawn tight, voice low, hands steady with coin. They always seemed so sure, so certain, so ready to pay for silence, to reward precision, to honor a quiet death with gold. But behind their confidence was fear, and behind fear the oldest instinct, self-preservation. The assassin didn't expect thanks. They didn't expect kindness. But payment? That was supposed to be part of the deal. Do the job. Collect the coin, vanish. That was the rhythm. Clean, simple, brutal. But clients had a rhythm of their own, one that often ended in betrayal. Sometimes it started before the job was even done. A note slipped to a guard, a bounty posted with a vague description, a deal made with someone else. A second assassin hired to follow the first, just in case. Other times the betrayal waited, lurked, followed behind the job like a second shadow. You'd complete the mission, you'd walk away, and then silence. No payment, no message, no trace. So you'd return, risk exposure, demand what was promised, and the client would say it wasn't done right. Too messy, too loud, wrong person, wrong time. The poison was too slow. The blade left a mark. The message wasn't received. Always an excuse. Or worse, they'd vanish. Entire homes emptied, staff dismissed, records burned. The man who begged for help just a week ago no longer existed. His smile a ghost, his promise a joke. That's when the real danger began. Not from the job, from the betrayal. Because an assassin who was owed coin was dangerous. An assassin who was lied to, deadly. But clients rarely thought that far. They thought only of their own names, their own secrets, the whispers that might spread, the trail of coin that might be found. And so they cut the trail before it formed. They buried it, or tried. Some sent killers after the killer. A second shadow, a cleaner, someone who didn't ask questions. Others used poison, a cup of wine, a meal offered in celebration, a toast to a job well done, the final gesture before the knife twisted once more. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the assassin drank, trusted, let their guard drop. But the good ones, the careful ones, they knew better. They tasted the wine first. They fed the meat to a stray dog. They watched the eyes of the client as the cup was poured, and when the betrayal came, they were ready. They left the meeting with silence, with steel, with vengeance, Some found the client days later, others took weeks, some never found them at all. But they always looked, because betrayal, unlike death, wasn't clean. It lingered. It infected. A broken deal wasn't just a wound. It was a challenge. And assassins, for all their silence, hated to lose. So they hunted, and the hunted ran. Some clients hid behind walls, behind guards, behind names. But walls crumble, guards sleep, names can be unmade, and eventually they were found. In a bath, in a cellar, in a church. No place was sacred, no place safe. Because the assassin didn't want the coin anymore. They wanted the silence back. They wanted the betrayal buried. They wanted the world to know that a deal meant something. That trust, even among monsters, had rules, and those who broke them bled. The lucky clients died quick. A blade in the dark, a rope in the rafters, a cup overturned, and a final breath. The others died slowly. They were made examples, not for others, for the assassin, to remind themselves that failure had a price, that trust was a fragile thing, and once broken, it cut deeper than any sword. Some clients begged, pleaded, claimed they were forced, threatened, manipulated, but assassins didn't care for reasons, only results. A job done is a promise owed, and a promise broken is a wound that must be sealed. In blood, always in blood. Others, seeing what happened, tried to change, tried to honor their end, paid in full. Sent extra, left gifts, but it didn't matter. The seed was planted. Assassins trusted no one now. Every job was a trap. Every deal a deception. Every client a liar. So they prepared. They brought backup. They scouted exits. They demanded payment in advance. And still, betrayal found them. Because human fear is stronger than agreement. And when faced with death, even the boldest client chose silence over silver. So the assassin changed again. They stopped taking jobs from nobles, from merchants, from men who wore cloaks and spoke too softly. They worked only through intermediaries, through rumors, through old contacts who still owed favors, and even then, they watched their backs. Because the one truth they learned was this: a blade is honest, a poison is honest, a betrayal is never honest, but it is always waiting. Saison 15. No, retirement lonely. And retirement didn't exist. Not for assassins, not truly. It was a story told by those who didn't know better. A dream whispered by fools who hadn't yet drawn blood. The idea that one could walk away, lay down the blade, vanish into a quiet life of peace and forgetfulness. It was a fantasy, a lie, because the past didn't forget. The past hunted. Every job done was a name remembered, a face etched in a moment of pain, a consequence waiting to unfold. Time didn't erase these things. Time sharpened them, and the assassin knew this. They tried, some of them. After years of silence, they disappeared into distant villages, bought land, built fences, learned to farm or tried to, married, had children, changed their names, wore soft clothes, sang lullabies, and for a time it worked until the knock came, not loud, not angry, just a knock. A question asked too politely, a stranger in the market who looked too long, a letter with no sender. Then came the fear, the blade under the bed, the sleepless nights, the need to walk the perimeter every hour, the urge to run because someone had remembered, someone had whispered, someone had followed the trail backward. And suddenly the quiet life wasn't quiet anymore. The assassin had to choose, stay and fight, or vanish again, leave behind the family, the name, the peace. Most chose to run because fighting meant others would suffer. And assassins, for all their coldness, didn't kill without reason. So they ran. Again. They grew older, slower, weaker. The blade didn't move as fast. The breath didn't hold as long. The steps weren't as silent, but the work didn't stop. Because coin still spoke, and death still listened. They took smaller jobs, simpler ones, ones that didn't require climbing rooftops or swimming across rivers. But the danger was the same. One mistake, one loud footstep, one wrong face, and it would end. Some assassins disappeared without a trace. Others were found years later, bones in a collapsed barn. Some died in taverns, mistaken for beggars. A few were hunted down, killed by children of the dead. No one remembered them. No one wrote their names. No one told their stories. They faded, like fog, like smoke, like breath in winter. There was no retirement, only endings, and endings were always lonely. The longer they lived, the more the world changed without them. Cities expanded. Taverns they once knew were torn down and rebuilt. Faces they had seen once and never again now belonged to grandchildren and strangers. The assassin aged, but their world did not age with them. When they passed through towns, no one recognized them. Not because of a disguise, but because they were forgotten. Forgotten, not by accident, but by design. They had erased themselves so thoroughly that even they had trouble remembering what they looked like when they were young. Sometimes they stayed in one place for a little while. They'd sweep the streets, fix a roof, tend a fire, and the townsfolk would accept them as a quiet, odd old person. Useful, mysterious, never dangerous. But the quiet always broke. A new traveler came through. A voice said something familiar. A scent brought back a memory, and the assassin knew they couldn't stay. So they left. Again. Always again. The body began to betray them. Knees aching, eyes dimming, hands trembling. But they carried on, because stopping meant being found, and being found meant death. They no longer feared death. Not exactly. They feared what might come before it. Recognition, revenge, regret. The coin they had saved grew thin. Spent on food, on tools, on shelter, but never on comfort. Comfort was a trap. Comfort invited memory. Comfort led to hope, and hope was dangerous. In the end, most assassins didn't die in battle. They died alone, in forests, in ruins, in the rain, a blade still within reach, a plan still half-formed, and when they passed, the world did not pause. No one wept. No one noticed. They were a life spent in shadows, and their death was just as dark.